Okay, as we start talking about triangles, there's some useful vocabulary we want to review, some basic vocabulary. If you remember the classifications of angles, this is really easy. An acute triangle, a cute little angle, remember those are the angles that are less than 90 degrees. Okay, so if it has three acute angles, it's going to look something like this. Okay. If it has a right angle, remember that's your 90-degree angle, it's going to be a right triangle. Remember the symbol for that was that little box in the corner. A right triangle, the two sides that make up the right angle are called legs, and the other one is the hypotenuse. We'll talk about that vocabulary more later. Okay, a triangle with one obtuse angle. So obtuse, remember, are the angles that are greater than 90. Okay, that's going to be obtuse. And that looks something like that. Okay, there's my angle that's obtuse. Okay, and then the last one, three congruent angles. Remember, congruent means they all have the same measure, and that's called equiangular. Okay, the Latin prefix equi means equal. So if you notice in this picture I just drew, I'm going to mark the all three congruent because these are just sketches. They're not perfect, so you want to go by the markings. If you notice, my acute triangle and my equiangular look a lot the same. And that's because in an equiangular triangle, it will always be acute. Okay, those angles all measure 60 degrees, and we can talk about that more later. But an equiangular triangle could be called acute, but you always want to use the most specific vocabulary. So you can also classify triangles by their sides. So for the first four that we went over, those were angle classifications. Now let's talk about the side classifications. The difference between the two is really about the definition. Okay, if you notice, all of these definitions have to do with the angles. There's one more thing I want to mention about the angles actually. Notice that all of them have acute angles. Okay, so when you're making your angle classification, it's really important that you're always looking at all three angles. Make sure you have all three angles, and the one that you're actually classifying is always going to be the largest angle. So keep that in mind as you're doing the practice. Okay, sides. So triangle has no congruent sides. That's called scaling. Okay, again, I'm just doing a sketch, but really I'm going to go by the markings. All three of these have different number of hashtags on them, so that, or tick marks, whatever you want to call them. So those mean that all three sides are different. If I have at least two congruent sides, so in a picture it might look something like this, that's called isosceles. Hopefully I'm spelling that right. And there is more vocabulary with isosceles that we'll talk about later, but the two sides that are congruent are called legs, just like in your right triangle. Those are called legs. And the non-congruent side is called a base. Okay, if all three sides are the same, again, that equi means equal, and lateral means sides. So if you have all three sides the same, it's equilateral. Now again, isosceles and equilateral look a lot the same, but they don't have to. But equilateral, by definition, this says at least two congruent sides, so you could call that isosceles. But again, you want to use the most specific vocabulary. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So as I mentioned, you got two ways to classify these, so you really have to think about what the definitions mean. Okay, and this, it asks for angles first, sides second, so let's go ahead. It's like having a first name and a last name. The angle classification has to do with the angles. So as we look at these angles, they're all less than 90, so I could call it acute, but more specifically, they're all the same. So acute would work, but let's give it the most specific classification we can. So it's equiangular, that's by the angles, and now by the sides. all three sides are congruent. And so if sides are congruent, that's equilateral. So it's an equiangular equilateral triangle. In triangles, if it's one, it's always the other. We'll talk more about why that works later. If you have more than three sides, though, like in a quadrilateral or a pentagon, that is not necessarily true. Okay, so in this one, I've got, I see two of the angles. Remember, it's really important. Do I know all three? Oh, yeah, that symbol right there means 90. And again, the one that I want to classify when I'm doing my angle classification is always the largest one. So this is a right triangle. And now to do the side classification. All three sides have different number of marks on them. So no congruent sides, that's scaling. Okay, and then my last example. Okay, I've got two acute angles, but those aren't the ones I want to look at. I want to look at my largest angle. My largest angle is greater than 90, so that's obtuse. And these two sides are the same, so that's scaling. I'm sorry, that's not scaling, that's isosceles. Okay? All right, go try some practice.